Greetings, my fellow establishments. Today is, of course, Halloween, so I have brought you a recording of the building of Chaos and Order's enclosure, while I read a Halloween scary story. This is handwritten, which I have written, of course, and you shall watch, of course, the enclosure of Chaos and Order. So, without further ado, I present to you my scary story, for which I have written. At the beginning of the episode, I would like to say Happy Halloween. Now listen closely to this story. It is quite a doozy. The story is called The Dark Mind. Jerry was walking home on a dark, windy night. His gelled brown hair flowed through the wind. The silvery moonlight reflected off the small puddles on the side of the muddy road. Jerry held tight to his tan leather jacket. His boots groaned with every step on that road. His black business pants swayed with his legs as he walked. What a dreadful night, Jerry said to himself. The black sky seemed to block out all light except for the moonlight, which screamed a path along that muddy road. The trees rocked back and forth in the wind. Their decaying leaves shrilled in the wind as it swept through them. The leaves hit Jerry several times as he walked. On a night like this, Jerry sighed, anything can happen. Jerry wasn't frightened by this night, but more exasperated at it. His old back strained with every step. I'm back in boot camp, he said to himself. It began to sprinkle, and then steadily go into a downpour. The few oaks along the side of the road seemed to come alive to drink this vital resource. Jerry started to run. His hair became slick and wet. The gel washed off in seconds. It streamed down Jerry's face like tears. He continued to run, holding his jacket closer. The path's puddles were splashing as huge drops fell on him. Jerry could see in the distance his cobblestone manor and his cottage on the hill. He could also see the path which he had to cross, which was a bridge also made of cobblestone. He approached the bridge, and as he did, the rain stopped suddenly. The wind breathed its last breath and then perished. Jerry stopped, shocked by the sudden weather changes, but more surprised. Jerry walked cautiously towards the bridge. He took one step on that bridge cautiously. Nothing happened. He took another, as if expecting something to happen. But nothing did. He took another, and then another, and then another. But still nothing happened. He stopped once he reached the middle of the bridge, and he looked down at the moving river below. He jumped back when he saw his reflection. Unlike a cat on catnip, he thought. He looked down once more. He saw something white as he peered out into the river. It seemed to soar above him in the water, and suddenly he jumped back again, for he heard his name called. Jerry, it moaned. It was like poison down his throat. Jerry. It called again in what sounded like a woman's voice. Jerry. It called once more. Jerry looked around, but he saw no one. He was confuzzled about why this voice was coming and where it was coming from. He looked across the bridge. He stood still as he saw the witch tree. Jerry. Once more the voice called. What do you want? He asked exasperatedly. Jerry. He sized up the tree. In its black branches, he saw it. He froze, paralyzed by something that made his spine shiver and crawl. All of his hairs raised like hackles on an angry dog. Jerry. A white raven gleamed in the darkness. Its maroon eyes seemed to stare into his soul. It cawed once, and it felt like nails on a chalkboard, which made Jerry's skin crawl. Once more it cawed. Jerry looked up at the perched bird. He swore to himself. "A stupid bird," he said to himself. "Go on! Shoo! Shoo!" he yelled at the bird. The branches of the tree swayed, but there was no wind. "Go on!" Jerry said once again. Then Jerry noticed that the tree branches were filled with other crows of black. They all cawed at him, mocking him. Jerry stepped back. Jerry's eyes adjusted. How did the birds get there? He thought to himself. And then it hit him. The tree wasn't filled with ravens. It was made of them. They cawed at him like a satanic choir. Then, suddenly, they flew in the air towards Jerry. He screeched, but it sounded like a raven. He looked down at what were supposed to be his hands, but instead black, leathery wings were there. He tried to look at his nose, but it was now a long, thin beak. His black beak was narrow. It shimmered in the moonlight, until the moon was covered by ravens, that is. The menacing eyes stared at him. Then they dove towards him. They surrounded him. And Jerry tried to call for help, but all that came out of him was caws. The pesky birds pecked him with their long beaks. The tiny pecks felt like needles on his skin. He didn't like it. Or feathers, that is, Jerry thought to himself. Either way, he didn't like it. There was a fury of beak and feathers. Jerry watched with horror as his skin was torn, but no blood came out. And then as he noticed that he was looking at himself, the white raven appeared, and the others seemed to bow before it. Its eyes looked like a bloody corpse. It stared him down before speaking. "Jerry." "What do you want?" Jerry cawed in a hoarse voice. The creature moaned once more his name. "Jerry." Jerry just stood there, unable to move. He fell to his knees. He dared not take his eyes off the birds, though. The white raven approached him as he was on his knees with its beaked face. It took one last look, as if figuring out where to bite him, or rather peck him, before plucking his eyes out. This time, he felt pain. Immense pain, like a wave of electricity through his body. He blacked out immediately. When he opened his eyes, Jerry was in a room full of mirrors. The floor and ceiling were made of chalky white marble, and Jerry could see the imperfections in the wall. The wall behind said mirrors was also made of the marble. The mirrors showed a figure like himself, but without a face, just skin. He looked at himself again. He was dressed in a loose, baby blue hospital gown. Jerry's head was pounding. His hair was desert dry, and it looked like it was bleach in the mirrors. He looked down at his arms, for they were not wings anymore. "I'm not a bird anymore," he said to himself. Everything in Jerry's body was sore. Jerry, once again, looked down at his surroundings. He also looked up. A blinding bright white light shined down on him. Jerry looked at the figures in the mirror, and they copied his movements, staring back. Jerry's spine shivered when he saw the facelessness of the creatures looking back at him. His feet tingled on the cold marble floor. A small white and yellow fleece stood on one end of the room in a small corner. "A blanket!" he exclaimed. He walked over to the blanket and held it in his flaky hands. It was as warm as a small fire. Jerry wrapped it around his feet to warm them. Then he lied down in that corner and huddled to himself. He just sat there for what felt like Years. Time passed, and Jerry just sat there. He didn't talk or think or do anything, really. He just sat. He wasn't hungry or thirsty. He just sat. He wasn't weary or wide-eyed. He just sat. He didn't close his eyes for a second, though, as he just sat. One time, when he was sitting, he heard whispering. Another time, he heard weeping. The figure sat with him, of course, in the mirrors. But Jerry still felt alone. He would look into the mirrors every once in a while, as if expecting something to happen or something to take him. But nothing happened. Jerry then began to get twitchy. His eyes would move back and forth from the mirrors to the floor. He began hearing chanting. The whispers became more pronounced. Jerry would sometimes hear a clock ticking and talking. Jerry began to have breakdowns and seizures. His eyes would move at the slightest movement, and dust particles seemed to suffocate everything else. Jerry could feel tears streaming down his face. "Help me!" he screamed. He began shouting gibberish. His face began to mutilate. The light seemed to stare at him. Jerry yelled at it over and over. He hated the light for it staring back at him. "Stop looking at me!" he screamed. This series of events happened over and over through a period of time. Jerry would just sit, and he would just weep. He would whisper to himself inaudible language. He would hear the clock ticking and talking. Tick, tock, tick. Then finally, one day, or was it a day, he stood up and screamed at the mirror. But he didn't like what he saw. One of the figures in the mirror, as he looked back at it, looked exactly like him. It sat in a corner with a small white fleece, just like his. It was huddled there, even though Jerry was moving and was off the floor. A crash sounded from behind him. Jerry turned around quickly, and a little handheld mirror stood on the floor. He looked around, and all the figures had a face and the fleece, and sat huddled in their corners. None of the mirrors were smashed, but Jerry found it weird that there was just a small mirror. He picked it up. It showed a faceless figure in its reflection. It was himself. Jerry didn't like what he saw, so he screamed and shouted at the figure in the small handheld mirror. He wept and cried and copied, but it was him. He couldn't deny that. Finally, Jerry took the mirror and he smashed it against the floor, and it broke into a million pieces. All the pieces still had the same faceless face staring back at him. His face, his face, his face. Jerry stomped on the pieces and yelled at them. "Stop looking at me!" he would scream. Suddenly, the light burnt out. It was black all around. Jerry fell backwards immediately for some reason and blacked out. He now awoke in an old Chicago alleyway. The brick walls marked the separate building looming above. Jerry saw the art festival of colored graffiti. It was dark in that alleyway, only to be illuminated by a yellow street lamp on the black road outside. Behind him was a tall wooden fence, old and rotten, with tastes of moss on its brown surface. It blocked that escape exit, of course. Black garbage bags littered the ground, and a plethora of trash was spread across the narrow alleyway. Jerry touched his face. He was wearing a black ski mask, Jerry was fitted with black wool gloves as well, some gray trousers, and an ashy gray jacket too. He felt a blade in his hand. Its hilt, a fine wood, was stained and dusty. Jerry couldn't put his thumb on what it was stained of, though, but it was brown and red. Its silvery fine tip was reflecting the yellow-orange light of the street lamp. Jerry heard weeping. He approached one of the pile of big bags to find only a young girl. She looked about 6 or 7, and she was dressed in a small pink polka-dot dress. Her fine red hair smelled like sun-ripened strawberries. She had black tap shoes with bright white socks. Her green eyes strained, and her face was covered with tears. She had looked like she had been crying for hours. She looked up and saw him, and curled into a ball, crying louder. "Help! Please! Somebody!" She wept. Jerry moved closer to comfort her, and he tried to drop the knife to tell her it was okay, but his hands didn't cooperate. Jerry tried again with visible contortion, with no luck. He tried talking to also comfort the girl, but nothing came out of his mouth. It was like being in another person's soul, but not being able to control their body. "No, stop," Jerry tried saying, but no words came out. Suddenly, he felt his hands twitch, and then, without warning, he started crabbing the girl. I'm sure you can run away with that. That is much worse. She screamed like a banshee. Her eyes flooded with even more tears, and they started streaming down her face like a waterfall. Jerry was crying also at the event he was witnessing of him crabbing the poor girl. He lifted the blade and kept crabbing her, as blood was dripping down from it. It was slicing through her ribs like a hot knife on yak butter. She screamed louder and louder with each crab. Jerry was absolutely terrified and scared that he couldn't do anything to help the girl. Each crab felt like a needle in his heart. Finally, the girl stopped screaming. Her body lay limp. The deed was done. Jerry stood, looming over her with fear in his eyes. His jacket and pants were covered. A puddle swarmed around the body. Suddenly, blue and red lights filled the alleyway. "Put your weapon down and come out with your hands up," a voice called. Jerry tried to speak, but nothing came out. His face was covered in sweat and tears. And then he took the blade and slid it between his ribs. The pain was excruciating. Jerry fell to his knees crying. Blood pooled around him, and he pushed the blade farther into his body because he didn't want to witness to the events that were happening next. And then he blacked out again as he fell to the floor on that asphalt. A middle-aged woman stood crying over her child in a hospital bed. "Is there any movement, doctor?" she asked. "I'm sorry, but no," the doctor exclaimed. The woman started bawling. "We've tried everything. Electrotherapy, acupuncture therapy, and even injecting a certain type of chemical inside of him, but he just won't wake up," the doctor said, trying to comfort the woman. "My baby's gone," she wept. The doctor funneled the woman out of the room. A 10-year-old boy sat still in his bed, with cuts all over his face. His eyes were shut up tight, and white and baby blue blankets were covering his short little legs. The poor boy sat there motionless, but he slept peacefully, regardless of what was happening outside. There, he just slept. He slept. This story tells the fictional story of a boy who was in a coma from a car accident for 37 years. No one knows the depths of the mind, especially in those 37 years. Psychologists can't even figure it out so far, and yet the human mind is a a lot more extensive than we know of. But fear, loneliness, and being cold can change anyone's mind from being a sweet person into a cold-blooded killer. We'll never know the depths of the mind, at least, not yet. And so, with this to end off this scary story, I tell you that the mind is a dark mind. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope you have a happy Halloween. The rest of this video will be me building and proceeding to build other parts of Chaos and Order's enclosure. I don't get a lot done, but this episode was mainly for the purpose of the story. We will get back again on our feet, hopefully sometime early November. Expect the next episode and I will show you all that I have done, not just this part. Thank you for watching. Please do like, subscribe if you would like, or not. Just watch it with care. Thank you for all the support that I've gotten in the recent years. I say this again, happy Halloween, because I love Halloween. And have yourselves a fantastic holiday. If you don't celebrate Halloween, have a great night. And afterwards, have yourself a great Dia de los Muertos. Again, too. I'm not one who celebrates that holiday, but I know that some of you are. So, happy holidays. We shall begin next episode. Alright, I'll see you all later. This is Editor Aaron, signing off.